In The Psychology of Money, Morgan Housel reveals that money is less about complex math and more about human behavior and daily decisions. True wealth isn't built from one brilliant move, but from consistent choices over time, embracing humility in the face of risk, respecting the power of compounding, and creating a margin of safety against the unknown. This book dismantles the illusion of financial genius and offers timeless lessons on why people think and act the way they do with money, and how anyone can build lasting wealth through patience and strategy, not shortcuts. Chapter 1. Money is simple in math and fiendishly complex in human behavior. The first chapter establishes that almost every financial outcome is ultimately shaped by psychology rather than spreadsheets. People make decisions under uncertainty, with imperfect information and emotions that bias judgment. These human factors explain why identical financial facts produce wildly different results for different people. The chapter explains that small, repeated choices compound into huge outcomes, consistent saving, modest but steady returns, and time in the market matter far more than a single brilliant trade. It stresses patience as a strategic asset. Long horizons let randomness average out and allow compounding to work. Yet patience is fragile. Social comparisons, envy, fear, and impatience push people toward action that feels productive but destroys value, chasing hot stocks, timing markets, or leveraging up on short-term narratives. The chapter introduces a theme that repeats throughout the book. What appears rational in one person's context can be irrational in another because goals, timelines, and tolerances differ. Wealth is therefore personal. The right decision depends on who you are, what you want, and how much volatility you can tolerate. Practical implications follow. Focus less on headline returns and more on behaviors you can sustain over decades. Design finances around your temperament and life plans. And remember that the most important financial skill is not complex calculation, but the ability to behave sensibly when everyone else is panicking or euphoric. Chapter 2. Luck and risk are twin forces that look identical in hindsight, yet require opposite responses in planning. This chapter differentiates between outcomes caused by chance and outcomes produced by skill. A successful entrepreneur may be a genius, lucky, or a mix of both. The same applies to investors. Because outcomes combine skill and randomness, humility is mandatory. Don't assume that past success proves superiority, and don't assume failure proves incompetence. The chapter illustrates that people who succeed early often attribute results to talent while overlooking fortunate timing or tail events. On the flip side, prudent risk management recognizes that rare negative events can wipe out decades of progress. A single ruinous loss can end a plan, no matter how many prior successes you enjoyed. The practical lesson is to build systems that survive bad luck, diversify, hold cash cushions, avoid ruinous leverage, and plan for scenarios you don't want to see. In behavioral terms, we must accept that luck will sometimes make us look undeservedly successful, and that risk will sometimes punish the deserving. This perspective reduces hubris and increases resilience, two essential attributes for long-term financial survival. Chapter 3. The idea of enough is a central psychological pivot in financial life. People often chase ever higher benchmarks, more money, a bigger house, fancier status symbols, without pausing to define what would actually satisfy them. The chapter explains the difference between being rich, high income, being wealthy, owning assets that provide freedom, and appearing wealthy, consumption that signals status. True wealth is often invisible. It's the investments not shown on social media, the savings that provide options, the freedom to say no. Conversely, visible consumption creates social pressure and a treadmill of comparison that erodes real financial security. The psychology here is simple but powerful. Defining enough prevents endless escalation and reduces exposure to ruin. It encourages modesty in goals and clarity about trade-offs. Do you want the comfort of owning assets that generate options, or do you want the status of outward displays? The chapter argues for constructing an internal metric of success rooted in freedom and time, not external validation, because that internal metric aligns behavior with long-term outcomes rather than short-term applause. Chapter 4. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy require different mindsets. Aggressive strategies can produce spectacular growth, but also expose you to catastrophic loss. Preserving wealth demands humility, diversification, and an emphasis on optionality. This chapter contrasts the gambler's mentality, seeking outsized payoff without contingency, with the steward's mentality, building buffers, maintaining flexibility, and planning for tail risks. It emphasizes that risk management often looks boring, saving consistently, avoiding leverage, and keeping a margin of safety. Yet these boring habits are what allow compounding to continue uninterrupted over decades. The chapter also highlights how identity and ego sabotage preservation. People who feel invincible take risks to prove themselves, while those who accept limits build stability. The practical takeaway is to calibrate ambition with prudence, pursue growth, but never at the cost of ruin. Structural protections, diversified portfolios, adequate insurance, and conservative assumptions are the differences between a lucky spike and a durable legacy. Chapter 5. Compounding is simple in principle, but resistant to human intuition. The chapter explores why time in the market matters more than timing the market, and why a few extreme events often produce the majority of returns. Human attention biases, seeking immediate feedback, overreacting to short-run noise, and craving novelty, undermine the slow, often invisible work of accumulation. The chapter explains practical habits that align with compounding, maximize the number of years you participate by starting early, protect progress from catastrophic setbacks, and prioritize behaviors you can sustain for decades rather than heroic shortbursts. It also underscores that savings rate often matters more than investment return. How much you save each month compounds into options later. Finally, the chapter links psychology to structure. Systems and rules help you avoid impulsive decisions, and a focus on process, consistent saving, rebalancing, tax efficiency beats chasing the next hot insight. The core message is that time plus sensible behavior is the most reliable lever for building lasting wealth, and that cultivating the patience to see compounding play out is the single most valuable financial skill. Chapter 6. A few events often explain most of the outcomes we observe in finance and life. This chapter examines the outsized role of tail events and the illusion they create about cause and effect. Many stories of success and failure are driven by rare, extreme occurrences: an entrepreneur's breakout product, a stock that becomes a multi-bagger, a crisis that wipes out fortunes. Yet humans prefer neat narratives that attribute outcomes to skill rather than to randomness. The practical implication is twofold. First, recognize that broad patterns often hide skewed distributions. Second, design your life and finances to benefit from positive tails while surviving negative ones. That means embracing strategies that allow rare upside, owning equity, staying invested across many opportunities, but simultaneously protecting against ruin, diversification, cash reserves, prudent leverage. Housel reminds us that the existence of tail-driven returns makes judging plans by short-term results dangerous. A few lucky years can mask poor strategy, and a single bad year can erase decades of sensible compounding. Therefore, humility in interpretation and conservatism in planning are essential. Expect that extremes will matter more than averages, build optionality into your decisions, and avoid the trap of assuming your observed winners prove a repeatable formula rather than one of many possible outcomes. Chapter 7. Freedom Control over your time and choices is the highest dividend wealth pays, and this chapter reframes financial success around the ability to do what you want with your time. Most financial advice focuses on returns, allocations, and optimization, but Housel points out that the real purpose of accumulating assets is to gain autonomy, to work because you choose to spend moments on things that matter to you, and to avoid being coerced by financial necessity. This perspective changes priorities. Instead of maximizing income for the sake of status, prioritize building a margin that gives you room to breathe and decide. The behaviors that buy freedom often look conservative on paper, saving more than peers, limiting fixed obligations, and resisting lifestyle inflation. But their payoff is an everyday liberty that money alone does not guarantee. Housel also warns that chasing freedom through risky shortcuts, high leverage, speculative bets, often backfires. Genuine freedom comes from durability and resilience. Thus, financial planning should aim not merely for a headline net worth, but for a life structured around control, flexible commitments, optionality, and the ability to say no. That is the quiet, enormous power of money used well. Chapter 8. People assume finance is a purely technical problem, but at its core, it is behavioral. This chapter argues that reasonable often beats rational because real-world decisions must account for emotions, social context, and the need for sustainability. A theoretically optimal plan that you cannot follow will fail, while a slightly suboptimal plan you can stick with will win over decades. Housel emphasizes that personal tolerance for volatility, temperament, and the social environment shape what choices are workable. For one person, owning volatile assets is tolerable. For another, it is ruinous. Therefore, craft financial rules tailored to your psychology, simple rules, margins for error, and habits you can maintain without excessive stress. The point is not to be perfectly logical according to an economist's model, but to be consistently reasonable as a human being. This human-centered approach reduces catastrophic behavioral mistakes, panic selling in a crash, over-leveraging in a boom, and increases the chances that long-term strategies survive life's emotional storms. Chapter 9. Wealth is often invisible because it's embodied in assets not yet spent. This chapter explores the difference between being wealthy and appearing wealthy, and the social dynamics that push people toward display rather than real security. Public symbols, luxury cars, large houses, flashy consumption, signal status, but do little to buy optionality or resilience. Housel shows that many truly wealthy people live below their means because they value freedom and longevity over visible validation. The psychology of social comparison explains why this is difficult. Humans are wired to compare, to emulate, and to seek approval, which fuels consumption that undermines real financial progress. The antidote is intentionality. Define what wealth means to you in terms of options, time, and durability, rather than in public applause. Build habits that prioritize hidden savings, diversified investments, and low fixed costs. Over time, invisible wealth accrues and compounds, producing the outcomes that flashy displays cannot: security, choice, and the power to live by your values rather than by others' expectations. Chapter 10. The future is unpredictable, and surprises are inevitable. This chapter examines how to plan under deep uncertainty by privileging robustness, flexibility, and long-term participation over precise forecasting. Markets, technologies, and fortunes shift in ways no model can reliably predict, so the rational response is to prepare for many possible futures rather than try to guess the single correct one. Practically, that means staying invested to capture unknown upside, maintaining cash and safety to survive downturns, diversifying across assets and approaches, and keeping assumptions humble. Housel emphasizes that humility about what you know and what you can tolerate reduces the risk of catastrophic mistakes. He also notes that success often hinges less on clever predictions and more on the ability to survive long enough to be present when positive surprises arrive. Thus, the best plan blends patience, protection, and participation. Protect against ruin, be small and flexible in bets you do not fully understand, and remain invested in the broad trends that reward long-term exposure. Chapter 11. Saving is simple in principle, but psychologically profound in its implications. The act of saving is less about sacrifice and more about buying optionality, time, and freedom. In behavioral terms, saving is a vote for future choices, a declaration that you prefer to have the ability to act later rather than maximize consumption now. This chapter explores why a high savings rate is often more powerful than a slightly higher investment return, and why the decision to save is as much emotional and identity-based as it is numerical. Most financial advice emphasizes asset allocation, returns, and timing, but Morgan Housel repeatedly returns to the primacy of the savings rate because it is the engine that fuels compounding. If compounding is the machine that builds wealth, savings is the fuel you must continually add. Yet humans struggle with consistent saving because present bias makes immediate pleasures feel disproportionately valuable relative to future benefits. Social comparison intensifies the problem. When your peers display consumption, saving looks antisocial, odd, or even pitiable. The psychological work of saving is therefore twofold. Construct an internal narrative that values future optionality and create systems that make saving automatic. Pay yourself first, automate transfers, and set rules that reduce daily friction and temptation. Importantly, saving is not just a behavioral tweak, it is an identity choice. People who identify as savers behave differently under stress and opportunity. They resist lifestyle inflation, they accept slower short-term growth in exchange for long-term security, and they make decisions that preserve optionality. The chapter also addresses the moral and emotional dimensions. Saving is often framed as prudence, but in many contexts it is an act of courage, choosing a path that yields benefits mostly in a future you cannot yet see. That requires a conviction that the future will matter, that small daily decisions accumulate, and that consistency trumps occasional brilliance. Housel cautions against fetishizing frugality for its own sake. The point of savings is to serve life goals. The discipline of saving should therefore be aligned with what you value. Are you saving for independence, for opportunities, or for security? Once the motive is clear, saving becomes sustainable because it is not merely denial, but an investment in the life you prefer. Finally, the chapter deals with the interplay between saving and risk. A robust savings cushion increases your tolerance for volatility because it provides a margin of safety. You can weather market downturns without being forced to sell, and you can pursue asymmetrical opportunities without risking ruin. Thus, saving is both a psychological stabilizer and a strategic enabler. In sum, the act of saving is deceptively simple yet fundamentally transformative. It shifts power from short-term impulses to long-term agency, and it buys the single most valuable financial asset, time. Chapter 12. Risk is not the same as volatility, and understanding this distinction is essential to making durable financial decisions. Volatility is a mathematical measure. Risk is the chance of permanent loss. Human psychology often conflates the two, reacting to daily market swings as if every dip threatens ruin. Housel's point here is practical and behavioral. You must design plans that survive the possibility of bad outcomes rather than chase the illusion of higher returns that come with fragile assumptions. This chapter unpacks how people misunderstand risk because they evaluate investments through the narrow lens of expected returns rather than through the broader lens of survival and optionality. For example, a strategy that promises high average returns but carries a small probability of total ruin fails the most basic test of financial prudence. Chapter 13. History is not a perfect teacher, but it provides the context that our models often ignore. This chapter insists that understanding how financial systems behaved across varied historical episodes should temper our confidence in simple narratives. People form mental models from recent trends and then extrapolate linearly into the future, ignoring how fragile certain patterns are under stress. Housel argues that the most successful long-term strategies are those built to accommodate many different historical outcomes, rather than those optimized for a single, expected scenario. Practically, this means valuing robustness over narrow efficiency. The chapter analyzes recurring historical themes, bubbles driven by narrative, crashes produced by leverage, and innovations that surprise even seasoned experts. It also examines how cultural memory shapes behavior. Societies that experienced hyperinflation, for example, behave differently than those that did not. Preferences for cash, skepticism about banking, and unique savings habits emerge. For individuals, appreciating history means humility about predictions and a readiness to adapt. This translates into financial habits such as maintaining diverse allocations, keeping dry powder, and structuring liabilities to avoid forced selling during downturns. The psychology here is recognition that present conditions are an outcome of lots of past contingent events. Treating the status quo as permanent is both arrogant and dangerous. Housel further explores how personal history, one's experiences with money, upbringing, and formative events profoundly shapes risk tolerance and decision-making. Two people with identical portfolios can behave completely differently because of divergent life stories. Thus, the chapter emphasizes tailoring financial rules to personal history and temperament rather than chasing an abstract optimal portfolio. In short, history teaches humility, prepare for many possibilities, learn from past episodes without assuming they will repeat exactly, and design systems that keep you resilient across unpredictable futures. Chapter 14. Behavioral patterns that produce wealth are rarely dramatic. They are consistent and patient. This chapter dives deep into the mundane mechanics of building fortune, rebalancing, avoiding forced sales, tax efficiency, and the discipline of sticking to a long-term plan. Housel emphasizes that while narratives celebrate brilliant entrepreneurs and outlier winners, most sustainable wealth emerges from repeated, boring decisions compounded over decades. The psychological challenge is staying committed to these unglamorous habits when they feel unrewarding and when external incentives push toward action. The chapter offers concrete behavioral prescriptions: maintain a process-focused mindset, track progress in ways that reinforce persistence, and design feedback loops that reward the right behaviors rather than short-term gains. Examples include setting automated contributions, creating rebalancing rules that force selling winners and buying laggards, a contrarian discipline that runs counter to the market's noise, and using tax-aware strategies that preserve compounding power. The heart of the chapter concerns the mental architecture required to perform these tasks, establish routines that minimize decision fatigue, remove temptation through environmental design, and cultivate communities or accountability partners who share long-term priorities. Housel also warns of the psychological potholes, overtrading, herd behavior, and the seductive illusion of control. Each of these behaviors is emotionally gratifying in the short run, but destructive over time. The remedy is structural: make the desirable action the path of least resistance. Chapter 15. Money and happiness are intertwined but not synonymous. This chapter explores the nuanced relationship between wealth and well-being, and argues that financial choices should be judged by how they contribute to a life you want to live, not merely by how they maximize an account balance. Housel dismantles common myths. Money does buy comfort and reduces certain anxieties, but it does not guarantee meaning, relationships, or internal fulfillment. The chapter presents a framework for aligning financial behavior with the true drivers of satisfaction: control over time, security against catastrophic shocks, and the ability to allocate attention to what matters. The psychology of spending is central here: how people derive utility from purchases, the role of adaptation. We quickly return to baseline happiness after many material gains, and the social comparisons that distort perceived utility. Thus, prudent financial planning must incorporate hedonic realism, anticipate how consumption will actually affect your happiness, and prioritize investments that deliver durable value, experiences, autonomy, and relationships over transient status goods. Importantly, the chapter addresses regret minimization. People often look back and regret missed relationships or lost time more than missed riches. This insight reframes what enough should mean. Wealth should be a tool to avoid regrets by enabling purposeful choices. Practically, this implies a balanced financial life. Save sufficiently to secure options and endure volatility, but also spend intentionally to buy experiences and freedom that compound in well-being. Chapter 16. Investing is as much a psychological discipline as it is a technical one, and this chapter explores the many behavioral frictions that make good investment plans fail even when they are mathematically superior. People chase performance, trade too often, and confuse activity with progress because action produces the immediate emotional reward that patience does not. Markets are noisy, and the human brain is wired to respond to noise as if it were signal. Each headline, every quarterly report, and every viral narrative triggers impulses that undermine long-term outcomes. Successful investing thus depends less on finding the perfect asset and more on creating an environment that prevents yourself from self-sabotage. That environment has multiple components: a portfolio structure aligned with your temperament and goals, simple rules for rebalancing, pre-committed plans for contributions, and safety buffers that prevent forced, emotionally driven selling. The chapter examines how fees, taxes, and behavioral costs compound into real losses over time. A small percentage of fees or a habit of selling low after panics can erase years of compound gains. It also addresses the trap of financial professionals whose incentives are misaligned with clients' long-term welfare: sales-driven advice, performance-chasing strategies, and short-term compensation structures push many into suboptimal behaviors. The individual investor's defense is humility, simplicity, and an appreciation for the limits of prediction. Instead of complex speculation, the chapter advocates for broad participation in the market through diversified holdings that capture the long-run growth of economies, combined with tactical conservatism, enough cash and low-leverage posture to sleep through crises. Another behavioral insight detailed here is the role of commitments and rituals. Automatic monthly investments, dollar-cost averaging, remove choice at emotional moments and harvest the market's volatility. Equally important is the mental accounting of success and failure. Investors who view losses as a natural cost of participation are less likely to panic, whereas those who frame drawdowns as personal failure are prone to destructive reactions. The chapter closes by stressing that the leverage point in investing is not market timing, but behavioral engineering. Design a plan so that the rational choice is also the habitual one, because over decades, the habit compounds into outcomes that no short-term cleverness can reliably match. If you want to win in investing, the largest returns often come from doing the boring things consistently and from avoiding one catastrophic behavioral mistake, not from finding the next big stock tip. Chapter 17. Narratives shape money decisions far more than numbers do. This chapter dives into the stories people tell themselves about wealth, risk, and success, and how those narratives distort judgment. Humans are meaning-seeking animals. When we observe complex events, we compress them into simple stories that fit our worldview. That compression is useful for communication but toxic for decision-making because it creates illusions of cause and effect where randomness is actually the driver. Once a neat story takes hold, this industry is finished. This new CEO will remake everything. Crypto is the forever future. It pulls behavior toward extremes, massive concentration, reckless conviction, and little contingency planning. The psychological danger is that good stories are persuasive precisely because they feel right, not because they are correct. The chapter outlines practical defenses, cultivate a plurality of narratives rather than a single explanatory myth, practice counterfactual thinking by asking how a different chain of events could lead to the opposite result, and preserve optionality so that you are not committed to one storyline. It also highlights the social contagion of narratives. People adopt them en masse because they are emotionally gratifying and socially validated, producing bubbles and crashes that seem inevitable in hindsight. Learning to prefer uncertainty over neat narratives is uncomfortable but immensely valuable. Financial success often requires holding two contradictory truths at once: a belief in a long-term plan and an openness to changing that plan when new data or risks emerge. Chapter 18. Institutions, incentives, and systemic frameworks matter because individuals operate inside systems that bias behavior. This chapter explores how market structures and social institutions shape financial outcomes and why understanding those meta-level forces is critical for long-term planning. Markets are not pure meritocracies. They are ecosystems of incentives, regulatory frameworks, compensation schemes, cultural norms that reward certain behaviors and punish others. For example, short-term performance incentives in asset management encourage risk-taking that generates headline-grabbing returns for a few quarters while transferring tail risk to investors over longer horizons. Similarly, corporate governance structures, tax rules, and social insurance systems alter how people save, invest, and spend. The psychological implication is that many personal finance failures are not purely individual moral shortcomings but responses to systemic pressures. Recognizing this reduces blame and invites smarter strategies. Design personal financial buffers that compensate for structural misalignments. Choose institutions and advisors whose incentives align with your long-term welfare, and lobby or vote in ways that improve systemic resilience. The chapter also considers how cultural narratives, status signaling, consumption norms, and prestige markers are reinforced by institutions such as advertising, media, and credit supply. Those forces make it harder to maintain the quiet, invisible behaviors that produce real wealth. Thus, practical finance includes institutional literacy. Understand the rules of the game you are in, and then design your strategy to exploit the system's stable features while mitigating its predatory tendencies. Finally, the chapter emphasizes reciprocity and stewardship. As beneficiaries of stable institutions, individuals have a role in preserving systems that allow compounding, trust, and intergenerational transfer. In the end, personal prudence is necessary but not sufficient. Thriving over the long term also demands an awareness of the institutional ecology that shapes choices and outcomes. Chapter 19. Ego and identity distort financial judgment more than most people admit, and this chapter maps how status-seeking behaviors, identity signaling, and the psychology of self-worth lead to fragile financial lives. Money gives status, but status often demands consumption to maintain. People conflate net worth with self-worth, equate spending with success, and make decisions to impress others rather than to secure their options. This dynamic is pernicious because social validation provides immediate reward, while financial prudence provides deferred, uncertain benefit. The result is a treadmill. As incomes rise, expenditures rise in parallel, leaving little long-term improvement in optionality or freedom. Housel's behavioral insight here is blunt. The most dangerous comparison is the one you make with neighbors, co-workers, or curated feeds. Escape requires recentering identity away from external markers and toward internal measures, time autonomy, relationship quality, and the capacity to act on one's values. The chapter provides concrete tactics, define explicit financial goals that map to life outcomes rather than social metrics, create enough thresholds that trigger behavioral changes once reached, use visible frugality as a deliberate signal of values rather than a secret shame, and practice radical transparency with trusted advisors or partners about finances so social pressure cannot be weaponized. Chapter 20. Synthesis and a Pragmatic Playbook. Practical rules that bridge psychological insight and everyday action, because understanding is only useful when it changes what you do. This chapter assembles the book's behavioral lessons into operational guidelines. Decide your time horizon and design your finances to survive it. Prioritize savings rate and optionality over chasing marginally higher returns. Build margin of safety in cash, diversification, and low leverage. Make your best financial moves automatic to avoid emotional errors. Define enough to shut down the comparison treadmill. Protect your max drawdown capacity so compounding continues. Avoid narratives that require absolute certainty. And use long-term identity cues, rituals, rules, and communities to sustain prudent habits. The playbook emphasizes humility and survival as core principles. Assume you will be wrong sometimes, and design systems that let you live to fight another day. It also frames money as a tool for freedom. The ultimate objective of financial decisions is to increase the range of valuable choices in your life, not to maximize a number. This reframing transforms daily budgeting, investment allocation, and career decisions into means for buying autonomy, time, and relationships. The chapter closes by noting that the real payoff from this approach is psychological. Fewer regrets, less anxiety, and a life more aligned with what you truly value. Wealth built under these principles is durable not because it beats the market every year, but because it endures through crises, adapts to new realities, and ultimately converts financial capacity into a life of meaning. Conclusion: the psychology of money shows that financial success is not a function of superior calculation, but of sustainable behavior, consistent saving, humility about risk, patience for compounding, and the courage to align money with the life you want. Small, disciplined choices over decades matter far more than heroic gambles made for the sake of status.